And he's over his period of grieving, and he sees a harlot. But Tamar had saw him coming, and so she put on a veil to pretend to be a harlot. And she's going to try to get back at him because she didn't feel like he fulfilled his promise. The point being is, Judah quickly just went into a harlot because he sought to please himself. And then in chapter 39, we see Joseph, a younger brother, put in a situation in a house of Potiphar, a woman of great esteem and recognition, and it seems to be in private. But Joseph maintained his integrity. No doubt Joseph knew, God is with me if I remain with him. Look at verse 2 as Zach read to us this morning. And the Lord was with Joseph. Look at verse 3. And the master saw the Lord was with him. And verse 5. The Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. Verse 6. And Joseph was a goodly person and well favored. And then in verse 9. Listen to the words of Joseph. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? He maintains his integrity because he knew God is ever with me. And no matter what I face, no matter the situation, even if I think I can get away with it, no one would know. I magnify God by where I go because God is ever with us as long as we are with him. How can I do this to God? And our lesson this morning is not to diagnose and say, here's a location that would be good for a Christian. Here's a place that would be good for a Christian. That's not the point. But in his situation, he realized God is with me and he's blessed me. And how could I do this to him? And Joseph suffered. And it may be that you and I, in trying to magnify God by where we go, suffer because we have integrity and we want to please our God. And we know that he's with us and he'll bless us as long as we continue to be faithful to him. He promised it to Moses, to Joshua. The Hebrew writer reminds Christians that God will be with us and never forsake us. So we magnify God where we go because he's promised that he'll never leave us. And we can know we can be pleasing to him by what we do and where we go. Look at verse 21. So after he refuses Potiphar's wife's advances, he's thrown into prison because of her false accusations. Verse 20, the master put him in prison. Verse 21, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. You and I may suffer because of our integrity, because we know God is with us. And how could I do that to God? But we may suffer, and God will never leave us. And Joseph was blessed, and he continued to receive blessings. And I love the statement of Joseph recorded in Genesis 50. He says to his brothers, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. We'll talk a little bit more about God's providence in just a second, but he had the attitude that was correct, that I'll maintain my integrity and I'll please God because he's ever with me, and he's promised he'll never leave me, so why would I leave him, even in a situation that Joseph was in? Our second point this morning from the book of Esther, if you'll turn and look at the book of Esther with me, Esther chapter 4. We magnify God by where we go because God's providence is ever at work in our lives. The prayer this morning is that we may be able to have someone providentially. We're able to see this. We're able to recognize, and we take those opportunities and notice when those doors are open so that we may magnify God, and then we may be able to teach a soul. We always say hindsight's 20/20. What that really means is I can look back on my life and I can see God's providence. And I can say that for certain. The three of my children, because I look back and I see God's providence and how things worked out for us and how that we were able to have the children that we wanted to have. And so many opportunities and so many times we look back and we see, because as one writer said, it's providence, non-providence. It's a dilemma sometimes because you and I don't always know. And as Mordecai, the relative of Esther, she's put in a situation where she's queen. Of all the women that the king saw, he chose her. And then they find out the Jews are going to be destroyed. Haman and his evil plan, when he approaches the king, he says, there is a certain people that want to rise up against thee. But then later when the decree was sent out, it specifically said the Jews. Mordecai finds out and he sends word to Esther. And I love Esther 4:14. When we think about providence and we think about the book of Esther itself and how it's a record of God's providence. Verse 13, really, then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, think not that thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall there enlarge and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. If you don't do it, God will make it happen from somewhere else. And then he asks a great question. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. Who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Because Mordecai couldn't pinpoint it. He couldn't say, this is exactly God's plan. It's been revealed to me. But Esther, if you don't do it, someone else will. And how do you know that you didn't come into this house in this situation in this time for this purpose? Remember in the book of Philemon, in verse 15, Paul's encouraging Philemon to receive Onesimus back, and he says, how do you know he didn't depart from you for a time so that you might receive him again? Because Onesimus left, became a Christian, and Paul says, Onesimus, you need to go back. And now Philemon can receive Onesimus as a brother. How do you know? Paul didn't know for sure, but he says, maybe perhaps that it's such, that he left. You and I magnify God by where we go, not only because God promises he'll never leave us, and we always have him with us if we don't turn on him, but how do we know that God's providence is not at work in our lives? And so wherever we may be, a foreign country, here in the States, going back home to where we grew up, how do we know that God's providence is not with us? I also want you to consider the humility and the courage of Esther, as it's always talked about her courage and how that she had to go approach the king in hopes that he would receive her, and he did. But I love each time when she goes before him and the humility, because it's contrasted so much, her humility and Mordecai's humility in comparison to Haman's. Haman's so boastful and he's so proud. And when the king asked him, Haman, what do you think we should do to this great one that's done such a great thing for me, Mordecai? Haman's thinking only of himself. And when Mordecai did that great thing, and it's on record, did Mordecai ever boastfully go up with his chest with the king? He owes me something. See God's providence? The king was disturbed in his sleep and couldn't, so he said, bring the Chronicles, let's read it. And he finds out there's one that did something great for me. Again, God's providence. How do we know that God's not working in our lives through his providential means? So we magnify God by where we go because God is with us. And he promised he'll never leave us nor forsake us. We can be confident and go forward knowing that God will be with us. We magnify God by where we go because God's providence is ever at work in our lives. We maintain our integrity, we have courage and humility. But also I want us to consider in our third point this morning in Acts chapter 16, Paul and Silas. We magnify God by where we go because God deserves magnification even in the darkest of places. That's literal in Acts 16, but also figurative. You and I go places sometimes where we may move to a location and find out that there's not even the Lord's church, is not a congregation of the Lord's people for a long distance, especially when you get up further north and west. It may be that you live in a location, and it may be 30 minutes, an hour, 3 hours before there's a congregation of the Lord's people, which means there's probably no Christians around whatsoever. But we don't even have to be in that situation. We could go walk into the Kroger down there, and we may be the only Christian there. We may go to a foreign country, and we're the only Christian for miles and miles and miles. You and I are to shine as lights in the dark world. Paul and Silas face a situation that you and I will probably never face. First, because we don't have miraculous powers. The young damsel had been following Paul and Silas, and she had been declaring Most High God. And she kept following to the point Paul finally says, the evil spirit needs to be gone. And when the spirit of divination left her, she no longer served a purpose for those who were using her. And so they became angry. They put Paul and Silas in prison. And I want you to pay attention to verse 24. Who, having received such a charge, thrust them into inner prison and made their feet fast in the stocks. And the very next verse. And at midnight, Paul and Silas prayed and sang praises unto God. They're in the innermost part of the prison. And it could have been a long, tiring day. They had been physically assaulted. They had been shackled and thrown into this prison. There's no record of revelation given to Paul to say, Paul, you're going to get out soon. We know there was a miraculous event, an earthquake. The doors are opened and the shackles fell off their feet. But they could be sitting in that prison thinking, I wonder if this is it. I wonder if we're going to die. But they're singing praises and they're praying to God, even in the darkest of places, literally for them, but also spiritually. We may face times in our lives where things are so dark, not necessarily because of sin, but because of emotional stress, family stress, and things that you and I don't have control over. And we're in our darkest time, and that's when we shine the most. We shine not to bring glory to ourselves. And Jesus speaks in Matthew 5, verse 16, that we shine to bring glory to God. Others see our good works and glorify God. No doubt Paul and Silas had that in their mind, that they're singing and praying, not so that everyone says, well, look at them, look how holy they are. But we know that it had some type of impact. The earthquake had some type of impact. Because after the earthquake is over, and the jailer is going to kill himself because in his mind it's more honorable for me to die because I've let all these prisoners go. And they go rushing in. They say, wait, no, we're all here. And it's in the darkness. Have you ever noticed that? All of this is taking place in the darkness. And then the jailer calls for a light. All of it's taking place in the darkness. And he calls for a light. And he says, sir, what must I do to be saved? And they preach unto him Jesus and tell him, you must believe in the Lord. And they continue to shine as lights. They're singing, they're praying, their good attitude, recognizing that they needed to shine as lights in the darkness. To be Christians at all times, to magnify God at all times and in all places. Think about their perseverance. Think about their courage. Think about their willingness to serve, recognizing God needed to be magnified. And that evening, a man and his family put on Christ in baptism and were saved. I think what's so unique about this, and maybe you've picked up on this as we've gone through, but in all three examples, they all had characteristics that would be pleasing to God. They had integrity, they had courage, they had humility, they had perseverance, they had recognition that God needs to be praised, He needs to be recognized and magnified, even in the worst of situations. But all three of these examples were in locations that they did not have control over. Joseph didn't choose to be sold and go to Egypt. If you had asked him, Egypt would have probably been the furthest of places he would want to go. And put in a situation where he was wrongly accused, but he never stopped magnifying God, even in the location that he didn't choose. Esther and Mordecai, of course, they're taken into captivity. The Bible says Esther hadn't mother nor father. So Mordecai had raised her and took care of her, but she's in captivity. She didn't say, let me be queen, but she was chosen to be queen because of God's providence. So she was in a situation she didn't have control over. Paul and Silas, trying to do the will of the Lord. They didn't ask to go to prison. They didn't ask to go to the center of the prison in the darkness and to be shackled. But in all three of those examples, they didn't have a choice, but you and I have choices. You and I can choose where we want to go and to choose what we will do where we go. For those of you that are preaching students, don't be afraid to go somewhere that's maybe not the most popular place or as well known. Don't be afraid to go to another country or to do work in another country. It's a scary thought, but there's plenty of examples in the scriptures of men and women who were in situations they had no control over, and they magnified God. May you and I ever magnify God in the places that we're allowed to choose where we go. Let us remember as we leave the lessons that we've heard this week, that what we say, that what we do, that what we see, and where we go should always, always magnify God.